Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 382 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to get to work on upgrading our gold science, which is the last thing we need to do to finish up our faster-than-light research. Enjoy! And between the episodes, I have been working on upgrading a few things. The biggest change here is I upgraded all of the display logic for Circuit HUD as it pertains to our reactors. So I switched the reactor displays here from being just an on or an off signal for one particular reactor to giving every single reactor an on and off display and changing that to a percent. So now, if you see any power source down here, this number is the percent of how hard it's working. So clearly our deuterium setup is working at 100%. Of course, the accumulators are charged too, so that's why nothing else is running. And we also now have 6 groups of reactors, just because we've been building up the muons for that. So it's not good that these are running when the accumulators are full, but the factory is rather dormant right now, or at least it's researching, but without the upgrades to gold, it's just not going to consume the same amount of power as it would if everything was properly upgraded. And we do have an over temperature signal here to tell us if it gets too hot. And it's getting close, but you can kind of hear the frequency of the turbines changing. That they are slowly adjusting based on the surrounding requirements of power here. And now that the accumulators have switched back on, now they're working at full power and temperature's going to go down. And each setup has this. So our uranium-234 setup has been upgraded. Plutonium has been upgraded. Uranium-235 has been upgraded. And also, all of the thorium reactors have been upgraded. And they all essentially work in the same way, where each reactor group, and you might not be able to see it because of steam, yeah, it's in there. Maybe if we float over here to thorium, I can show you. And every reactor group has a combinator looking to see if any fuel is remaining in the reactor, which is how it was done before. And if there is, it gives a 1, basically saying this group of reactors is on, because the way the logic works is that they all have to turn on or off together. And then all of the signals are put on wires and sent down here. And it's 2 combinators. You could combine these math operations into one, but it's just easier if you have 2 if you want to change the numbers. So first, it takes the number of cells it gets and multiplies it by 100 to turn it into a percent. And it looks like we have more stuff. And you notice that solar panels are on here. And also the fuel block burners are on here as well. And I didn't notice it while I was talking, but you might have seen it, that the solar panel percent is accurately displayed based on how much percent power it's making. So it goes from 0 to 100 just based on the outside brightness, but it's not linked specifically to this brightness number. It's actually calculating its percent power output. And for example, if the solar panels can make power, but they have been disconnected from the electric network, which does happen sometimes, then this will be removed. And you can see now that one of the deuterium reactors is turned off, so now we're only getting 83%. And it's this one. And it looks like this one too just changed. So it's still making power, but what it's checking is the fuel in the reactors. And since these reactors are plenty hot and the accumulators are plenty charged, they have now turned off just because their fuel finally ran out. So they are very slow to respond to changes in the network, but they can. And they're starting to now. So we have 6 groups of reactors here. It multiplies it by 100 to turn it into a percent. And then you just divide by the number of reactor groups. And this is why I did these calculations separate, is because let's say you add more reactors, you just change this number. And then what you're left with is the percent of reactors that are online. And all of the nuclear fuels work basically in the same way. Another thing I did change is I reduced the request for all fuels except for thorium to 1 cell per reactor. This was inspired by our deuterium setup here, just to try to get as many fuel cells as we could, because getting these muon catalysts is quite slow. So the less fuel that's stuck in these reactors, the faster we'll get them. And another reason for that is that if you look at our bot capacity, it's currently 14. So if you make a request for something, even if it's 1 item, you're going to get 14 of them, because that's how many the bot can hold. So we can kind of test this by just putting a requester chest down here, and we could really request anything. Let's say copper plate. we want 1 copper plate. And it's on its way. But if you also see, it says on the way 14 plates. And you can also see that on the side of the window here where it says deliver 14. So even though we asked for 1, we got 14. And that happens here too. So if we ask for 1 cell, it will give us 14 of them if they are available. However, this runs into an issue. So let's say we requested 10 and then it drops to 9. Well, now it's going to get another 14 cells. So by setting these to 1, it puts less fuel in the logistics network and more in the reactors. However, I did not upgrade this logic for all of the thorium reactors just because there's so many of them. I didn't feel like doing that. Also, thorium is so readily available and easily made that it wasn't necessary. So the burner setup does calculate its power differently. And this is also accurate on how many of the setups are running. And our fuel burning setup is enormous. It's basically twice as big as it needs to be. But since it's already here, let's just calculate it based on what it is. And how it works is each one of these groups of 8 burners here, I guess I might accidentally call them reactors, they kind of feel the same way. But each one of these group of 8 is kind of its own setup, so it's calculated as such. And it just has a temperature sensor on this heat exchanger. It's not necessarily the one that's furthest away, but it's also easy. And then it sends its temperature signal here, and it's just saying, is it warm enough to make power? And if it is, you get a fuel block square. And it calculates for all of these. All of those signals are collected together and multiplied by 100, and then divided by 32, which is the number of groups, to get our percent number. However, we don't always want to display this because it's possible that some of these groups are actually going to be warm because we're constantly supplying fuel like this. However, we may not actually have the power latched. Looks like we have both uranium setups going too, so that you can see how dynamic this is in displaying power outputs. But it actually needs to be connected, which is a critical element to all of this. So if it's not actually supplying power, then there's no point in having it on this display. So it's checking to see if the power is latched. If it is, then the signal goes through. If it's not latched, then it doesn't matter how much fuel is going in here, it's not actually going to go on our display. And the way the logic is set up is essentially deuterium more or less always runs. Right now it's set to 75% for the accumulators, but that's more of a fail-safe just to prevent making a bunch of power if the accumulators are full, because we can't really turn them off after they're on. But in time, I want to try something new that I haven't done before. You've probably also noticed this G signal here. It stands for gigawatts, where we have 12 here, and we're making 12 gigawatts. And I'll explain how that works in a bit. And this power output includes the accumulators, both when they are consuming power and when they are providing power, but it would be annoyingly difficult to remove them from that calculation. So that's just an at-a-glance number of how hard the electric network is running. However, since we have created the G signal, it means we can actually turn on and off these deuterium reactors based on how many gigawatts the factory is currently producing, instead of the status of the accumulators, which I thought was quite fascinating. But we don't really have enough of them right now. Just having 6 groups isn't flexible enough to really take advantage of that. I'm hoping we will have more like 10 or 20 groups of them, and then we could really see what we can do. So let's jump down to where the solar panels are calculated. And this is our solar panel setup here, which is becoming increasingly tiny compared to everything else. And one other thing is that I got rid of the hidden decimal point in the fuel cell calculation just because it didn't seem like we needed numbers that were that precise. So this is now just the average number of fuel cells per reactor. You can definitely see how a lot of these are very low now that the numbers have been set to 1 cell per reactor, and also they're not very sensitive to missing their fuel. So let's say one of the reactors doesn't get its fuel for a while. The world won't end. The factory will continue without really noticing. The more important ones are like thorium and plutonium, and even plutonium has been set to 1. It's just we have a lot of fuel cells right now. And it looks like the sun's about to go down, so if you missed it before, you'll be able to see how the percent will go down dynamically. But how the solar panels work is it's basically reading the power output of this solar panel, which is isolated from the network, by using a power combinator. And it is hooked up to all of these lamps because the way that it works is that we want to calculate the current power output of the solar panel. And its power output is based on need. So we have to generate the need for 60 kilowatts. So by adding all of these lamps and putting a constant combinator in there to give them a signal to turn on to, we have an electric load that is a little bit more than 60. So that has fully loaded the solar panel. And then the power combinator will pull the numbers out of it. What we're interested in is power production here, not the maximum power production. And we're very close to the sun starting to set, so you can see these numbers kind of change in real time. So we might as well wait to see that. Okay, it's getting darker. Our night vision turned on, and you can see how the power production number is decreasing. So the first thing we have to do is take that power production number and turn it into something else. So I turned it into a solar panel here, the same indicator we're using. And the reason is because you just can't do math to these power combinator signals. I don't know why, but it's just how it works. So we had to change it to a solar panel first so we can do the math. So it's the same as before, where we multiply it by 100. And then we divide by 60, which is the total output of this solar panel, at least at maximum power. And then the number we're left with is the current power output. And you can see it's just gradually going down. And of course, it still has to be connected to the solar panel latch here, so it will only show up here if the solar panels as a whole are connected. And it's just about to lose its power. And there it goes, and now it's flashing. So the power outputs of our solar setup are relatively small. It's probably, let's see, that's about 700,000, that's about 200,000. So it's about 0.9 gigawatts for our solar panels. And compared to the 65 gigawatts we needed earlier, that gives you an idea about why we just don't have a bunch of solar panels in our factory, because it's not enough. And our big burner setup here, let's see what it can do. Yeah, about 8 gigawatts. If it could be fully loaded, which it really can't. And then it's about 8 gigawatts for each one of these uranium and plutonium setups. About 6 gigawatts for our deuterium, and then all of this puts out about 50, which is our primary source of power in the factory. Okay, the last thing to cover here is how I got that G signal. It uses the power combinator again, and the power combinator is very interesting in that you basically just put it anywhere. So long as it's in the network, it will provide the numbers you're looking for. And we can look at them to see what we're getting. Now, interesting to note is that the power consumption and production numbers have M's instead of G's. And that's because Factorio signals only go so high, and if it was a G, it would wrap over. So it has to give it to us in M's instead. So to convert the power here, we divide it by 1,000,000, which will give us the number in gigawatts, and I just chose G as the output. And I'm not terribly sure why I did ×1 for the signal, because it doesn't really do anything, because it's same going in and out. But the combinator's there, and I don't want to touch it in case it breaks something, so that is how I got that figured out. So now we have more useful information for figuring out our power levels. Of course, rocket launches continue. But important to note is that we have finally gotten our 1,000,000 science packs. And we got a few more than that just because there were satellites that were just stuck in the network. And of course, they would have found their way here and been launched. But now that all of the parts have been launched, we have 20 rockets just chilling out, waiting for parts. And that's basically how it's going to be now. We have been researching components. And honestly, we might as well throw a few more in here. And I kind of want to take the spaceship command out, because we really do want to get started on these protection fields, just because each one of them is going to take 100 energy shields. And if you remember from the recipe, it takes 2 of the previous tier of shield to go into the next one. And they have this recipe, which does allow us to skip 3 of the tiers and only use Mark IIIs. But instead of needing 100, we're going to need 1,000 and then an enormous amount of modules and blue circuits. I can't imagine that would be worth it. But we want to start that early because we would be making that from biter orbs. So the earlier we get started, the more efficiently we can use the orbs. Because if we end up getting too many orbs, we just burn them away. And they kind of get wasted because we have 300,000 orbs just sitting around right now. This does require the use of military science. We have not upgraded it. At least not to the same extent as the other setups. It has been upgraded to the maximum extent that it can be without just rebuilding it. And it has been silently making packs this entire time and shooting them in. So now we are fully seated with plenty of military packs. So for a time, they will be able to go at full speed, assuming Gold Science could go at full speed, which it can. But basically the point is that we have plenty of military packs and we probably don't need to rebuild it because we have a nice buffer. And these are the last two things we'd need them for. The other thing we'd want to build would be fusion reactors. And they kind of work in the same way, where it takes 2 of the previous tier to make the next one, and they use biter orbs. So it's going to be quite expensive, so the sooner we do it, the better. We also have the astrometrics research here to get the astrometrics lab. There's nothing special about the lab. However, what's interesting is that it actually does require space science. So we probably want to research that sooner, because when we do this, we will go below 1 million science packs and then we'll start making more. And since we need this anyway, we might as well. And then after we're in the long slog of the faster than light research, we can set the limit for the space science to be much lower, so we're not just constantly launching rockets for science packs that we'll never use. So we can set it to like 100,000 or something like that. So once we get below that point, it will try to fill it up, but we don't need to keep 1 million packs on hand. That's just, it accomplishes nothing, and it takes resources away from our research, which we'll almost certainly need. But it's a big research, but let's plop it in there, and then we might as well do Spaceship Command, which, short of the faster than light research, is the most expensive spaceship part to research at 240,000 packs. So it's not easy. And as far as spaceship parts, we have completed all of the components that we have access to, most recent one being fuel cells. So now we have some more parts to make. And the new part that we have access to is habitation. And this is actually an interesting part in that it requires 500 plastic bars. And it's annoying because we don't deliver plastic bars to the main bus. We delivered plastic bars by robot to make those bottles we needed for deuterium. So it's not too big a deal to just do the same for this. Let's check the filters. As we have less and less parts, it's more and more likely that we'll have a spot on here that we can use. And habitation is in here, so once again, we can make a new part and we don't need to change our priority. So it looks like we just got lucky with how we had it set up. The logic is the same as everything else. And that's probably going to be an enormous request. And of course it is. Let's just drop these numbers down a little bit. Okay, looks like we have most of what we need, so let's get it going. Just so many items that need to get in here. But it's going. We should see an immediate launch with this, where it gets picked up, placed into the rocket, and there it goes. So that's one more part off the list, and then hopefully it won't take too long to get life support systems done. And then we can add another one. And that's kind of how it's going to be now, where the rockets are going to launch on demand instead of all of the time. It is a little sad that they're not going all of the time anymore, but we only needed so many of them. And it is a huge drain on the factory to be constantly launching rockets that we don't need, especially when we have millions of science we need to research. So that'll probably happen pretty quick because we have all of those resources now. With that, it's time to calculate for our gold science. Coming back to our main setup, it needs to be 75 items a second like everything else. And before we jump into it, we kind of want to look at the numbers to get an idea for how we're going to want to build this. If you look at limiting factors, we're looking for stuff that's more than 1 belt of output. Silicon nitride is more than 1, but it's less than 4. So we could potentially put 2 belts of silicon nitride onto the science bus. However, putting things like 4 belts of tungsten powder, 4 belts of tungsten plates, 4 belts of cobalt steel plates, that's not gonna happen. But the other things, like getting this titanium in coil form, electronic logic boards, these are all reasonable for what the bus can do. However, now that we know these limits and how we want to handle them, we can calculate ahead of time instead of doing an after-the-fact patch like we did for glass here. And this worked pretty well, where we added the production of the huge number of items we needed to the science bus, so we didn't have to figure out, A, how are we going to upgrade this to do 4 belts instead of 1, but B, how are we going to get 4 belts of items here in the first place when the room doesn't exist? And it worked well. So I think we can do something similar. And we certainly have the space for it, and we might very well need it when you see how much space it took for 4 belts of glass. So looking at the numbers, we essentially need to divide these science packs by 4, because we need 4 belts of the limiting factors. And we also needed the 4 belts of glass, but if we had to have, say, 12 belts of items, it would be kind of crude to have like another mini bus coming down here with all these belts of items. Instead, it would be a lot better if we had 4 groups of setups, each with their own essentially foundry to make their items and deliver them. And then the only belt that actually needs to go by would be up top here, and it would just be the input items we need for the science. So it would be a lot more straightforward in that sense. So now that we know that, let's calculate for gold again and do a unique setup. And for gold, we'll say it's 18.75 items. The reason why I'm not doing it as 75 is that we would have to remember that every single setup is going to be divided by 4, and it would make the numbers kind of really weird. So instead, let's just set this number to the size that the setups will actually be. So once we have something, we can build it at the 1/4 scale and just build it 4 times, and then we'll have all the items we need. And this will also give us an idea of any throughput limitations on these individual groups of machines. Of course, this will get productivity modules, but it's also kind of a worthless number because we're not even going to build that part yet. But nonetheless, it does change the number of input requirements. Let's go down the heat-driven mechanical random number analyzer chain first here. Let's put these in there for now. None of those use productivities, so we just take it down to where it needs those tungsten plates, and those will have to be delivered in that form, as well as cobalt steel. And because we're dividing by 4 for this, now, instead of being 200 something, it's less than a belt. This setup will also need its plate choppers, but we're probably going to have different choppers for the titanium components, so let's calculate them individually. Where first we have this, and it's only 2 machines, but then when we put the plate choppers in there, number goes up. So that's actually not too bad. And then let's calculate for the coils. And definitely the slow thing is making the gears. And now let's calculate for the bearings. And the number's the same. It needs the balls. The number's a lot smaller, but they can just be direct inserted. And we also need a tiny number of plates. And since this plate chopper number is less than 1, I don't want to have a bunch of choppers just to say it's direct insertion. We can just use a belt, because the actual number of plates that it needs is very small. And we also need the tungsten gear wheels, which also comes from the tungsten plates. But we can use productivities, and it's also uses 3. And adding that to the tungsten plate requirement does not make it go over 75, so we're still good. And now we know the most limiting machines in this part of the build here. It's 2.9 for making these components here. So we can use speed modules on these other ones to get it below 3. And then clean it up if we have any extra space. And usually we have it, because even 1 speed module does an incredible amount of work. So that gets that side of this done. It's actually interesting to note that Gold Science does need 3 items instead of just the 2, so the setup actually making these is going to need to have an extra belt in there, which is going to make it quite large. And we have this copper waste byproduct, but that number is so small, a single machine can handle that. So let's back out, do the other component, which is the capacitor bank. It is much smaller and easier. A lot of these items are already going to be in their finished form when they get here, but things that won't be are the wires, both of which can use productivities, which is where productivity modules get very strong when you can stack them on top of each other. And we might be able to do direct insertion or not for this, it just depends. It's kind of a small setup, so in a way it almost doesn't matter. It's kind of like an afterthought compared to this side on how few machines are going to be doing this. But we need to make the steel wheels. We'll add the productivities. That does increase it to 6, so we have our limiting factor here. And 1 plate chopper is more than enough for that. So we probably could use these 2 plate choppers in single form, and then use 6 direct inserted, because the limiting factor would be the steel wheels. So if we put a speed module in there, we're good to go. And we have our output. It's also going to make some waste byproduct, but again, that's easy. It's going to need the silicon nitride, which we may or may not want to make here. We're actually making big and full requests for things now because we're not sucking in so many resources for the rockets. But our silicon nitride is actually quite wasteful right now, and it's for size reasons. When we calculated this before, I didn't mind not using productivities because what goes into it is just silicon, and that's easy enough to make. However, we're at the point where silicon is starting to go into a lot of stuff. Of course, it goes into glass, which is important. Going back to our calculation for that, even with all of our productivity modules, we're still going to need 36 silicon a second, which is more than half of our current maximum output of the factory. So it's not nothing. So at this point, we actually kind of need to save silicon. Not to mention, silicon is incredibly valuable in that it mixes with iron and with steel to limit the amount of iron that we're going to need, and we're going to need a lot of iron. So we're probably at the point that we would also want to make the silicon nitride better. Now the numbers are small enough to where we potentially could do it where we are now. But since the space is not big enough here, we would have to expand this bus. So the question is, do we expand this bus and add some logistics issues, or just send them up here to then be processed like glass here, where it comes in small form and then productivity modules makes it much larger. So going back, we have one more item. It's the virtual particle projector, which is really just a resource dump. Like, it's actually quite simple to make. It just has a lot of stuff that goes into it. The tungsten powder, of course, and just plain tinned copper wire and titanium plates, and then some rubies. So the limiting factor is 3 machines, so 1 speed module gets it done. And that's all there is to that. That's kind of the tricky part about gold, is that it looks so simple. But it's the numbers, the scale of the numbers, that's the issue here. But that's what we're here to solve. So looking at the requirements, none of these setups are going to share resources. So we're going to make the tungsten plates and cobalt steel for this part of the setup, silicon nitride for this part of the setup, and then tungsten for this part of the setup. So because they don't share their resources, it means that the part of the build that actually makes the resources can also be an integral part to the builds themselves. So when we're placing everything, we should keep that in mind. But for simplicity, when it comes to our hell mod plan here, we should probably make separate lines for them. We were talking about silicon nitride, so let's just put that in there. We do have the better chemical furnace. And of course, we'd want productivity modules, and this shows you we would need 156 machines just for the silicon nitride, just for 1/4 of the gold setup. So we are going to need a huge amount of space. However, it needs way less silicon powder. Acquiring the ingots might be easier because it's already on the ingots bus, but powder is on no bus. So it might make sense to just calculate it as a part of this setup, and it needs almost no machine. Basically just the one. Let's build the gold setup first, because like we were with doing our purple science, it took a while to figure out all of the limiting factors, and it's easier to just build the setup and see what's slow, and then you know exactly what to fix, rather than trying to fix everything ahead of time, because you very well may be fixing things you don't need to fix. So that's good, and one other input component is a small amount of nitrogen gas, but it would be way easier to just make this here rather than deliver it. Let's do the cobalt steel plates. We have better machines, and we have lots of productivities. However, we're going to need to do the molten cobalt steel, which gets us down to the steel ingots, and since the ingots are more dense than the molten steel is, we should probably deliver the ingots. And it only needs 1 machine, so easily done. And kind of like silicon, these numbers are big, but we'll deal with the slowdown when we figure out what the slowdowns are. But delivering the ingots kind of makes sense, because we're delivering the ingots with the silicon nitride as well, so it just makes it easier logistically. Plus, it leaves the ingots bus to actually figure out the logic of how to make these ingots, which is something we really don't want to be calculating up here at science. That is a job for the ingots bus to do. So that gets the cobalt steel So now we need the tungsten plates, which comes from the tungsten powder mixture, and we will crank it up with productivities. Luckily, the setup doesn't become too big. It's just that tungsten powder, being derived from tungsten, is a difficult thing to make. And this is a powder mixture, which only requires an input that is half of tungsten. So that definitely helps. And we now have two choices. We're right now only doing it with cobalt powder, but we have the choice of doing it with nickel. And which one is better? Well, it depends on which one's overloaded. But since we're using a huge amount of cobalt to make cobalt steel, and nickel is actually, does any science at all use nickel? I guess we can look. You know, I don't think so. Well, really, the big dump of nickel is military science. It definitely uses a lot there, but none of it goes into anything else. And even with our advanced processing types and logic, nickel is something that we kind of always have a lot of, and we're always getting rid of it. It's never overloading us anymore, but it's something we're still always dealing with. It's just, it's automatic now. And not something we need to think about. So I'm thinking the best input for this is nickel, because it actually gives it somewhere to go now. And just needs one speed module, which gets us down to the input of tungsten powder, 13.46. But we also need to put the 55 tungsten powder into this setup as well to make the virtual particle injectors. And that is rough. That's the end of this episode. On the next one, we're going to do some weapons testing and show the biters what atomic energy is like. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.